Hi, everybody. Thanks for tuning in today. We appreciate it. We're glad you're here with the movers and shakers of the real estate appraisal industry. I'm Tim Anderson, the appraiser's advocate, and we're here with Craig Morley. Now, we've had Craig here before, and we like Craig as a guest because number one, I don't have to ask him very many questions. He just goes on. And number two, he goes on because he knows. Now, just so everybody understands, Craig is a state certified general real estate appraiser in 3 states. He practices in Utah, Arizona, and Nevada. He is a former chair of the Utah Appraisal Board, and he currently is a member of the Appraisal Standards Board. However, in full disclosure, please understand, Craig is here as Craig. He's not here in his capacity with the state of Utah. He is not here in his capacity with the ASP. We're just going to talk about some areas of general concern to appraisers all across the country. Now that we have that out of the way, hi, Craig. How are you?
I'm doing so well. How are you this morning, Tim?
Craig, great. Thank you. I appreciate it very much. As always, it's good to talk with you. It's good to see you. And as always, my best to your family.
Thank you so much. Best to you and Debbie.
I appreciate it. Thank you. Craig, we have spoken off the air about various things. And while you and I don't script this, we don't even have notes. We do have some talking points. And as someone, you work with appraisers who find themselves in trouble with their state. I work with appraisers who find themselves in trouble with their states. And one of the questions that we're both getting, maybe not specifically the same, but generally the same, one of these questions is, what is it that I need to have in my work file? Now, we both know the answer to everything, but we've got to narrow it down a little bit further. So, as someone who has sat on the other side of that table and looked at reports and looked at work files and had to discipline appraisers, if you were to sit back on that side of the table again, which clearly you're not, but if you were to sit back on that side of the table again, what is it you expect, as specifically as possible, to find in an appraiser's work file?
I think there's some elements that are critical to have there, some that are nice, and some that probably don't necessarily need to be there. Probably the most important elements of your work file is, first of all, your engagement letter. Your client has reached out to you and has engaged you to perform an evaluation service of some kind. And having that written down. Now, sometimes, we might take an order over the phone and there may not be a written engagement letter, but I think most appraisers that are doing lender work are getting some kind of an email or something that outlines what their expectation is in terms of the fee and the turn times and our company requires this and that and the other, photo requirements, development approaches to value requirements, those kinds of things. Make sure that you get a copy of that in your work file. If you are not getting a engagement letter from your client, we've developed one that we send to everyone. In fact, we find that having some kind of paper trail that shows what our understanding of the appraisal assignment is in the work file is critically important, not necessarily from an investigative perspective, but certainly if there's questions that arise by your client about, well, gee, we thought you were going to do this or that or the other, and you go, well, you sent us you signed an engagement letter and you identified the intended use and the intended users. And if you're changing those things on me now, it's a new assignment and we're going to have to renegotiate what that's going to look like. And so I think, oftentimes we don't really look at that engagement letter as an essential part of your work file, but from my perspective, it's critical. And if your investigators from a state investigative agency are wanting your work file, that's one of the key components they're going to look at. And so I think that becomes very important. The other things, obviously, is that we're collecting public record data. We're trying to collect the information about the property that we are appraising. We're trying to develop an appropriate scope of work to solve the valuation problem that is before us. And once we've done that, then we're trying to aggregate the data that we need to solve the problem. And I think with a lot of the allegations of bias and other things, I think it's really a good idea when you go into most MLSs, they will, you're going to set up your search criteria. You're going to say, okay, I want everything within this geographic boundary. I want everything that fits a certain criteria. And having most MLSs will print that out as part of your output. A great idea to save that. Put it in your work file. So if somebody says, well, you're cherry picking comparable sales on the basis of something other than just plain old objective search criteria and analysis, you've got something that at least helps demonstrate that to be not the case.
Craig, thank you. Let's go back to the engagement letter for a little while. And you mentioned from an investigative standpoint, and let's go there. From an investigative standpoint, how important is an engagement letter, either one you send to the client or one the client sends to you? Is that engagement letter going to influence the state investigator one way or another?
It most certainly can. And an illustration, years ago when I was on the board, we had an appraiser who had been engaged by a property owner who had a farm and he was in foreclosure. And it was under the rural housing. And under the rules, they were allowed to use the Homestead Act, which allowed them to carve their home and 1 acre off from the larger farm. And so this appraiser was engaged to perform that. And he was doing it because the property was being foreclosed. And so he appraises this property. And as soon as he gets done with this appraisal, the property owner then, and this is prior to the HVCC, when Dodd-Frank, and so he gets a mortgage guy to now go refinance this so he can pay for or buy this property out of this situation. The same appraiser is engaged as the facts of the case unroll. Uh, the appraiser doesn't go back out and look at the property. This was within a fairly short period of time, and the appraisal comes back nearly double in terms of the appraised value of what he had appraised it for just a month or so before. And so in a small rural community, people know each other, and the homeowner now takes this low appraisal to the assessor and says, hey, you got my house assessed way too much. We need to get this thing lowered. Well, in the county there, they notice that there's a deed or a mortgage loan being originated that's higher than what the appraisal was. And so they see that a loan has now been obtained on this property and assume there has to have had a second appraisal. They managed to get a copy of the second appraisal. And they see that this appraiser has come up with two completely different conclusions within a very short period of time. And so a complaint is sent to the Division of Real Estate to go in and investigate this. And they want to see a copy of the work file. Well, this appraiser does not want to produce a copy of the work file and spends thousands. I can't remember the exact number, but he hires an attorney, and their argument is, well, this is a confidential document. You can't have it. And he doesn't, it's a foolish argument because within the licensing in the state and within USPAP, it tells us that it's confidential except on the one carve out is for state regulatory agencies can get a copy of this thing. And so he spent about 12 grand trying to keep the state from getting a copy of the work file. And it was really interesting because at the hearing, when he realized that the Division of Real Estate had copies of both appraisals, the court, why did you want my work file? Well, the answer was, we're trying to find out who has violated standards. Was it you, or did we have a mortgage company who is also licensed under the Division of Real Estate, who was trying to direct you to provide a higher appraised value? What was there inappropriate influence, or were you being told that you had to come to a certain conclusion or not? And that engagement letter would have been the thing that would either confirm or not confirm that the mortgage company was complicit in trying to get this higher appraisal for the refinance. And so oftentimes the scope of work that's set forth, uh, we essentially establish that scope of work, but is this a restricted appraisal or not? Who are the intended users? What's the intended use? We all know that the purpose, as we write these reports, we have an obligation to write the report in such a way to meet the intended use of the appraisal for the intended users. And the way that the division, the investigative or enforcement agencies know what level of information ought to be contained in that appraisal is found within the engagement letter that tells me what the intended use and who the intended users are.
So then having a copy of that engagement letter, either the one you send to the client or the client sends to you, is part of the work file as potentially a protection because you can show what it is the client expected you to do. And if it's not in the work file, or excuse me, if it's not in the letter of engagement, you can basically say, well, the client didn't ask me to do it, therefore I didn't do it. Is that correct?
Yes, that's really the objective.
Okay, let's go back to, you were talking about MLS searches. Let's go back to that for a minute. In the MLS search, you say, okay, MLS computer, here are the four corners of the neighborhood I want you to search. I want all the data in this neighborhood. So the computer prints it out and uh, you have a copy of all that data. Now, from a standpoint of the appraiser, is it important to have that list and even more importantly, the filters that generated that list in the work file? And if it is, why is it necessary to have both?
Yeah, I think it's critically important to have that in there because what it does is the thing that we don't want to be doing is necessarily searching by price. So I want everything between. I've got a home that's selling for 350,000. Show me everything that sold from 300 to $400,000. That might be a problem for you. We're targeting a price, and so that maybe you don't want that one in the work file. I would probably exclude that one,
You,
but if
you,
I'm it can condemn you as well as benefit you. You have to be if you're doing the job right. What I would be looking at is saying, okay, I want everything that is within 10 or 20% of the property and age, size, and set a geographic. I want it within a mile or two, and I want to look at listings. I want to look at pending sales. I want to look at sold properties within a certain time period. And what I like to do is once I've done that, I just print out a little summary of that. And the thing that I've discovered for me that works really well is that we have abandoned paper files. It is just too much trouble to try to keep track of paper files. And so what I'll do is I'll just print out the little summary sheet, pops that out, and within that print I can say print the search criteria, which I will do. And then I just save it in my download folder. And then within my software, there's actually a work file tab. And so I'll just pop that tab open, drag it in there, and it's there. Uh, then I will go in and say, okay, which of these many transactions, hopefully there's many transactions, am I going to select as comparable sales? I'll go select those based on proximity and physical characteristics. And I might select more than I'm going to actually use, but I want to take a deeper dive on maybe 9 or 10 of these properties. And so I will print the complete uh, MLS sheet, including the photos. And Tim, one of the things to keep in mind is that many of your MLSs are deleting photos when they put these things into their historical file save. And so many property owners are concerned because many MLSs have links to online services like Zillow that anybody can see. And they're going, I don't know how comfortable I feel about having everybody in the world be able to see the interior of my home. And so many of your MLSs, once the transaction has been closed, they've got a time period where these pictures go away. And if I've relied on those pictures, which I think most people do, in trying to determine the quality, the condition, and other characteristics of the property, uh, those may be gone if I'm using the MLS as my file storage place, and I go back and pull this up and only to discover that the information that I had relied on is not complete. And occasionally, it's not supposed to happen, but occasionally the agents have the ability to go in and change some of the data. So what you saw on the MLS looks a little different than what has been saved, on that historical record, which might create a little bit of a conflict for you as well. So I think the idea of printing that out complete with the photos, and again, and you print them out, put them in your download folder on your computer, drag it into your work file, and bang, you're done. And I think as you get into the habit of doing that, it becomes a real protection for you so that you can always go back and reference precisely what you saw when you were developing your appraisal, and you're not having to worry about if changes were made or if photos are gone or other changes may have occurred.
So, Craig, I think what you're saying is, well, it's perfectly acceptable to save data or to refer to data by reference. If you refer to those data by reference, and then when the state says, oh, well, okay, that's perfectly fine. Now we need to see the data you're referencing. Please forward it to us. And you go into excuse me, you go into MLS and you get a great big oops because it's not there anymore. If you've got it saved in your work file, your bacon has been pulled out of the fire. Is that correct?
That's right. That's exactly right. And then these things do change. It doesn't happen frequently, but I'm aware, especially on some of these things like new construction. You've got a property that's been advertised as a base model, and there's been some things added to that base model price. Maybe an extra garage bay, maybe there's been some square footage that's been added. And so sometimes that information that's being provided in the MLS is on that base model, but when they record the closed sale, they will change some of that. And so you're using this information that was available to you at the time only to discover that it's been updated and you weren't aware of some of these upgraded features that were added. And you can look pretty bad if that gets updated after you use the information and you don't have something in your work file that shows, well, this is what was available to me when I developed the appraisal. It goes much better. I'm aware of a fellow who had that exact situation happen. He's pulling off stuff from the MLS. There's a lag between the information being recorded on the county recorder's office. So all he's got is a closed price and the stuff that was in the MLS, which has now changed. So when the property owner who's unhappy with the results is filing the complaint and the investigator goes and looks at public records and county records, it's in conflict with what he's got in the appraisal, yet he used the best available information at the time and was unaware of some of these other changes that had taken place. And so it cost him a mere $10,000 to get out of that deal because of the inconsistency with the data.
Oh, $10,000. That's just a couple of appraisals. Okay, on.
Yeah, that's right.
Mine is, maybe the state of Utah really should have nailed him on that one.
That was Nevada, so
Oh,
yeah,
that
they tend to be a little more. Uh, they like collecting bigger fees, it seems.
okay. All right. Let's go back again to work file, to storage of materials. Now, it's obviously important that we have the data. And while the ideal might be everything is kept within the wings of a manila folder, as you indicated earlier, maintaining paper files is just too much of a waste of space. So most appraisers retain them electronically. Okay. Now, you and I were supposed to have this interview about a week and a half ago. And I got in touch with you and indicated that we'd had a real bad storm down here and our internet connection had been fried and the my wife's computer had been fried. Now mine was off at the time, so it was no particular big deal. But had mine been on, it's possible that it could have affected the memory. So let's look at the worst possible scenario. You're minding your own business. A horrible storm comes along and it fries your computer. And it takes with it all of the data on your hard drive. Now, that was an act of nature. Obviously, the appraiser is not responsible for acts of nature. So if the state appraisal board would just say, Tim, we need to see your work file on 1234 Elm Street. And I get back with the state and say, folks, sorry about that. We had a power surge and my computer was fried and I don't have it. And that was an act of nature and I'm not responsible for it. Therefore, you'll understand why I don't send you a copy of the work file. Is that going to fly?
Unfortunately, most of these folks aren't quite that understanding, and so we were talking to someone a couple of weeks ago in Bay St. Louis, Mississippi, and during Katrina, a lot of flooding had taken place. They had the paperwork files, and this appraiser reaches out to the state board and says, "Man, I'm really sorry, but my files all got damaged in the flood, and essentially, it's too bad. You're still responsible for the maintenance of those work files." And at that point, you're just praying that nobody files a complaint because you may not have the ability to produce what you've done. Well, there's many ways to deal with the electronic file storage of these things, and I'm not by any means out promoting any one company or any service provider, but there are a dozen different ways that you can back these things up. And for us, I've got a server. We have a quad array server. So that quad array server, which has 4 or 5 terabytes, each one of these drives back each other up. The one thing that you can rest assured of is that computers will fail and your drives will die. And you don't know when that's going to happen. And so having some way of having these things backed up is usually a good thing. Not only that, but then our server is backed up to an online service, and we have some triple redundancy going on because we're a little worried about being able to produce these things. And it's not just your work file; it's your financial records and everything else you kind of worry about. I'm far more worried about the receivables. If you want to know the truth, I don't want to lose that. So the ability to put everything within we use ANOW, which is a third party provider that helps to manage our work, manage the work file and orders and all kinds of things. Does a lot of good things for us. And one of the things that I love with this is that it's got an offsite built-in work file that's really easy to use. You just drag and drop stuff in there, and you've got it's backed up offsite. So if there's a power surge or anything else, it's pretty well protected. And I can't remember. I'd seen the other day what the encryption code or key was on this thing, but NASA would have a hard time, or the NSA would have a hard time breaking through the encryption code. It's 256-bit code key or something. And so I think the reality is that that there's lots of options for doing that. But if you're just leaving it on your hard drive, you're probably going to experience a bad result at some point in time. You need to have some offsite backup somewhere.
So, Craig, if we had to summarize what we've just been talking about, if if we were to say, okay, appraisers, you got to have a work file, and sure, there's nothing wrong with paper, and sure, you can reference stuff, but if you lose your papers, you're in trouble. If the stuff you're referencing is somehow lost or destroyed or changed, you're in trouble. And given the state of computer technology and the incredibly low cost of data storage per terabyte, it behooves the appraiser. Well, in other words, the appraisers can't say my dog ate it.
Right. Yeah.
Appraiser, the
Dog ate my homework. It's not going to fly.
it's not going to apply because it's too easy to maintain this stuff in 60, 11 different places.
Right.
So, okay, all right. I think that that's going to clear up what a lot of appraisers are asking about the necessity to maintain work files. So even though most appraisers work alone out of their house, perhaps even if they have a peripheral hard drive and they back everything up at the end of the day and then unplug the peripheral hard drive from the computer. So if there is a power surge, there's not a problem, that is probably going to handle the issue. And so when the state says, okay, Craig, we need to see your files, you can put files together depending on where you keep them. You could literally put your work file together with the push of a button. So the states are not going to have a lot of patience for, well, my dog ate my work file. Is that where we're going here?
Yeah, that's it. And there's so many offsite store, Google Drive, you've got OneDrive, you've got Dropbox, you've got dozens of different offsite storage capabilities, some of which you can just set up to automatically back up for you so you don't have to even worry about remembering some of these things. One of the things that I would caution people with too is that unless you are a genius, you're going to have lenders come back and ask you to address issues that may not have been clear in the initial report or need a revision made. I need you to add a borrower. I need you we've got a question on this or that or the other. And so you now have to go back into the original report that you'd submitted and provide some additional clarification or address some questions that have come up. And being able to have those things in such a way that you can make it clear uh, the sequence of what you did with that is I think, pretty important. I remember having somebody on the appraisal board, or when I was on the appraisal board, where that kind of thing had happened that resulted in them changing their opinion of value. And I don't remember what the circumstances were, if new data was provided or if there was something that was omitted. But in any case, you've got two appraisals now with two different values on exactly the same date. The report date, the data value is the same, but the report date's the same. I've got two appraisals with two different results. And you've got no. So the question is well, which one is the appraisal? I mean, we can't have two of these things where they're exactly the same date and same report and all of that, but I got two different results. What's going on? And most of us over the process of time forget stuff, like that. And so one of the things that I recommend that people remember to do is that go in and make sure that if you modify a report, put something in an addendum that says, okay, this is the original report date. On this date, somebody contacted me and told me it's new construction. They added a bunch of stuff. So I had to revise the report to reflect this additional stuff. It resulted in a different value conclusion. And now I have a new report date based on the new information that was presented to me, so that if somebody gets hold of these things, they can figure out which is the final report and why it was altered, and make sure that we've done everything according to proper protocol. And having the ability to look at that timeline is quite important, I think. And so making sure that your work file makes sense for the people who might be looking at it is good. The other thing that we found is that when we would be looking at work files for trainees and so forth that were applying for experience credit, some of these work files would be beautifully arranged. I've got my engagement letter here. I've got my public record here. I've got my comparable data here. I've got my zoning and other things over here. And they've got it outlined and tabbed, and you could see, here's the final version of my report is here. And they've got a beautiful job of laying this out. And then there's others where we would get, and it was just a mass of papers. You couldn't figure out, the report wasn't even stapled together. And so you couldn't even keep, I mean, you had data sheets inside of the report. And it was really, really hard to follow. And so I think doing a good job of keeping them kind of organized electronically, put a couple of folders in there if you want to, so that you can keep track of what came from where. But some of the stuff we do, I mean, you end up with, I'm doing some litigation stuff, and we've got thousands of pages of documents, and trying to keep track of that stuff can be quite tedious. And so having it filed and organized in such a way that you can find it and make sense out of it is pretty important.
Craig, okay, from the standpoint of keeping the file well organized, let's talk about that for a minute. Now, going back to the work file as not merely a repository of data, but as a tool for the appraiser, from a standpoint of rating the property and the standpoint of making the necessary adjustments, what has got to be in the work file for those two issues?
Well, I think the thing that I rely on most heavily, and I can only speak for myself on this, but I'm looking at photos. I'm looking at MLS photos. I'm looking at interior photos. I oftentimes will be looking at Google photos to try to figure out that, is this property backing onto some kind of a amenity or adverse characteristic? Do I'm looking for wear patterns in floor coverings. You're just trying to get a sense of what this thing looks like in order to try to come up with a quality and condition rating. And I'm trying to get a sense of what kind of views and what kind of neighborhood and what kind of locational characteristics were associated with my comparable sales, so I know how to appropriately analyze them to the subject. And one of the things that I see is, and I take this as kind of the negative side of the UAD property rating, is that because Fannie and Freddie and the GSEs are basically saying, listen, a house is either good quality or average quality, which I have no problem with. That's true. But the problem is nothing fits these definitions exactly. And it's either got a good, a beneficial view of something, or a neutral view, or an adverse view, or it's a neutral neighborhood, or an adverse or beneficial neighborhood. Well, what am I doing to support those ratings? And frankly, I think that if I'm going in and making those ratings, I want to explain that in the report itself. I may not necessarily need to have some external documentation in the work file if I've done a pretty good job of just explaining, why is this a beneficial neighborhood? Or why is this a beneficial view? Or why is this good quality? Why is my subject good instead of average? What happened to the property to make it good? And I think going in and providing more commentary than what we typically see, and trying to avoid some of these anecdotal kinds of ratings. Well, I just rate everything average. That way I don't have to remember the next time I use it what it was. And that's a really poor way of performing, I think.
So, from a standpoint of rating the subject and specifically the comparables, because we don't get in to see those. You're saying that the MLS photos, Google Maps, blah, 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 that kind of thing is going to be of a benefit. And because it's of a benefit, and because the appraiser will have depended on those to form, if not a value conclusion, at least a quality and condition rating conclusion, that those have to be in the work file, right?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
One
And
of the things, oh, go ahead.
and then not only that in the work file, but then in the report itself, an indication of why the appraiser chose the ratings based on those photos that he or she did, correct?
Right. And one of the things that we've found that has worked really well for us is that when we set an appointment, and it doesn't matter whether it's commercial or residential, we've got a fillable PDF form that we send out to the property owner that allows them to provide us with information that we can drop right into the work file. So it'll allow them to tell us what they've done to the property. I remodeled the kitchen, and this is what I did, and this is how much I spent. We put a solar system in. This is how big the system is and how much power it generates, and this is how much it's saving me every month. Uh, those kinds of things are very, very useful. And I think being able to drop that into your work file is incredibly helpful if someone has questions about some of that. And so I think having some kind of a little worksheet that you can provide to property owners to get back to you is a really good way to make sure that you're not forgetting some of the information that's necessary.
So the worksheet that you're talking about is something of your own invention. Is that correct?
Yeah, and if anybody wants it, would be happy to give it to them. It's nothing that's significantly proprietary, but it's just handy because they don't have to fill it out by hand. It's a fillable PDF, so you can type in the answers and email it back, and it just makes it kind of handy to get that back and put in my work file.
Okay. Craig, one last question before we wrap up, if I may. As we look at contemporary real estate appraisal, we're seeing a lot more articles in the media relative to homeowners who are claiming appraisers have engaged in bias or discrimination. And well, it's not, we don't have enough data to say, well, yes, they did or no, they didn't. So that is not going to be my question. But my question is, again, going back to the work file as a tool, how can we use the work file as a tool to demonstrate to state boards, to potential plaintiffs, that indeed we did not engage in bias or discrimination? What is it we need to do? What is it we need to chronicle in the work file? What data do we need? What memos do we need to record to show that we have done our jobs according to USPAP, according to state statute, according to Fannie Mae guidelines, and have not engaged in bias or discrimination?
Well, I think that probably the most important thing is as we chronicle the methodology that we used in selecting comparable data. That is really kind of the basis that we're using. Those who believe that some kind of discrimination is taking place is is oftentimes based on the assumption that the appraiser is intentionally filtering data based on some component that has some kind of racial component to it. And if we can demonstrate that, listen, all I did was go through this process, and frankly, within the body of the report, I think it makes sense to be able to go in and explain why I selected the comparable sales that I did. Probably one of the most frequent deficiencies that we see is a poorly done reconciliation. And in that reconciliation, I can really protect myself by going in and saying, okay, I searched this criteria here. I filtered it down to here. I picked these sales because of their physical characteristics, which, comparable one was this and had this. And so I thought it was pretty reliable. This one was less reliable because it hadn't been remodeled or updated or whatever the circumstances may be. And as we go through and explain to our client the process, it really kind of speaks against the idea of bias because I'm going through that process of doing this. Uh, Tim, let me just share with you something that I think helps deal with this issue as well. I was on a conference call some time ago as we were dealing with this very issue, and we had some agents of color who believed that there was racial bias in the appraisals that they were getting back. And so as we were asking, so give us some case studies, show us exactly what is going on. Well, you've got a young man of color who's an entrepreneur who's buying some of these old beat up houses and fixing them up in a urban setting and reselling them. The agent is a agent of color and that doing a very good job, very competent agent. In fact, she's gone through and selected properties that have similarly been remodeled and updated and provided them to the appraiser. The appraiser, unfortunately, I mean, fits kind of the stereotypical old white guy like you and me, and and he's not very nice, and says, "Thank you very much. I'm not going to consider anything that you provide. I'm going to select my own comparable sales." Well, probably not the best way to handle the situation. And I know for me, I'm always grateful if somebody gives me stuff to consider. I'm always happy to look at it, but I'm going to filter it and use what I think is most appropriate. And if they've got something that they're aware of, and when I teach classes to real estate agents, I tell them all the time, if you're aware of conditions associated with the property, tell the appraiser, write it down on a data sheet and says, hey, this property is located across the street, but what you might not know is that it was riddled with termites that was not reported in the MLS. And so they were going to have to spend a bunch of money to fix it or had water damage or had mold or some other thing that oftentimes you're not necessarily going to get in that MLS sheet. And I like knowing that information because I may decide it's just not worth the hassle of using it. Or if I do, I may, I'm going to try to take appropriate consideration for some of this stuff. And I think as appraisers, the thing that we have to do is we've got to act more professional. In fact, you've probably seen the study where doctors who have good bedside manners are far less likely to be sued for malpractice than the ones that have bad bedside manners. And I think the truth may apply to appraisers. I was talking to one of the state investigators, and he says we would have our complaints would be dropped in half if people were nice to each other. And so I think as we engage in our professional practice, acting professional, being patient and kind, and filter some of the things that we all would like to say to something that is more appropriate is always the best way to handle these things, and and make sure that we do a good job of maintaining a work file and explaining to our clients what we've done. Just one last thing I would suggest is that if you're doing restricted reports or where you need to augment your work file, uh, one of the neatest things that you've got is that on your phone there's an actual little app here that you just call voice recorder, and I've discovered that if I want to augment my work file so I can remember stuff, I can hit that little voice recorder. I can dictate some notes myself and put the audio file right in the electronic work file. And that way I can remember some of the analysis that may not be written down, but that I can have access to at some future date if I need it.
Craig, thank you. So the work file is a tool not only to protect us against charges of discrimination, etc., but to show to the state investigator that we did engage in a proper set of appraisal protocols to arrive at a credible value opinion. So Craig, again, let me thank you for your time. Let me thank you for the benefit of all your experience that us old guys have. And let me thank you as well for your service to the industry. I know that that concept means a lot to you. So before we say goodbye, is there anything else we need to take a look at?
Tim, it's just always such a pleasure to spend a little time visiting with you. And I hope that if you are getting tired of sitting around not doing anything, come out to some of these conferences that are coming around, and maybe we'll be able to rub shoulders with you. I know I'm going to the conference in Las Vegas in November with the National Association of Appraisers, and I'm looking forward to being able to see you, Tim, there, and anybody else who feels inclined to show up.
That's the appraisal summit, right?
That's right.
I'm asking the question even though I know full well what it is, as we both do. But yeah, Craig, I look forward to seeing you there too. Craig, again, thank you. My best to your family. And I look forward to the next time we get to chat. So thank you so much. And everybody, thank you for sitting in with us today. We appreciate it very much.
Thanks so much, Tim.